If a body catch a body. That's the whole trouble. You can't ever find a place that's nice and peaceful, because there isn't any. You may think there is, but once you get there, when you're not looking, somebody will sneak up and write "fuck you" right under your nose. Try it sometime. I think even if I ever die and they stick me in a cemetery, and I have a tombstone and all, it'll say Holden Caulfield on it, and then what year I was born and what year I died, and then right under that it'll say "fuck you." I'm positive, in fact. I read The Catcher in the Rye for the second time when I was 14 years old. The first time I read it, I was only in the 5th grade, and though it was exciting, my interpretation was clearly limited by my distance from any first-hand experience with the events described by the protagonist. However, by 14, nearly 15 years old, Holden's story and his worldview destroyed me completely, with a delicate brutality and a painfully desired mirror image. I selected The Catcher in the Rye as the focus of a book report assigned to me by my homeschool teacher, Mrs. Bybee. Mrs. Bybee was probably in her 70s, plump, gray-haired, her face occupied completely by a constant smile and the weight of very thick, wide glasses. She would come to my house every morning at about 11 a.m. Usually I was still sleeping or just falling out of bed, sometimes sitting on the front porch smoking a cigarette. She would wander up the stairs of our old craftsman house with the stone veranda, usually holding a Tupperware container full of cookies she'd made the night before. She had a patient demeanor. She was soft. That's the best word to describe her, soft. Sort of like a cotton ball or a marshmallow. Sweet, non-threatening, kind. We were a funny pair. My hair was long and dyed a bright turquoise blue, shaved on one side, face pierced, body clothed in mostly black most of the time. I had been kicked out of school again, or rather, the administration suggested that homeschool might be a better option for a student like me. A student like me was, according to counselors, principals, and teachers, unruly, defiant, and incapable of cooperating with the expectations of the school. After that final meeting with a team of education professionals, Mrs. Bybee was assigned to visit my house every morning until I took the high school proficiency exam when I was 15, and the school and I could part ways permanently. Much to my mother's surprise, the good-natured Mrs. Bybee and I got along very well. Up until that point, I hadn't been able to have anything close to a positive interaction with any kind of authority figure, including my mother, but for some reason I was nice to Mrs. Bybee, and she was nice to me. To be perfectly honest, I really liked her. She was sweet and never spoke to me in the same condescending way that most institutional figures speak to young people. She asked me how I was, didn't pester me about my smoking, and even asked questions about the kind of music I liked or the bizarre drawings that I made. We studied the basics: math, science, social studies, English. Most of the work was composed of independent study, and the book report could be based on any book of my choosing. I don't exactly know why I chose The Catcher in the Rye, but, as dramatic as this may sound, that very small decision would eventually be included among some of the most important decisions of my creative life. Truth is, I was a really bright kid, but I was a fuck-up, trying to dig my way out of a series of traumatic events and hopefully come out the other side with some semblance of a future. Just a few months before starting classes with Mrs. Bybee, I was placed in a high-security institution, at the tail end of a runaway suicide drug fistfight story, including abusive boyfriends, rape, and what felt like complete invisibility in school, with both teachers and students. My defiance was understood as simple teen angst, and the punishment delivered by the school was to remove me from all of my honors classes, a remarkable decision for a traumatized kid. I was smart, articulate, creative, and most definitely wounded. What I needed was space, creative stimulation, and most importantly, to be seen and heard. Winding up in an institution like that was certainly a turning point. I hated that place. I hated being watched. All I ever wanted was for someone to include me in decisions about my life. But strict policing was, and is, the default remedy for defiant teenagers, or anyone that can't fit into a generalized social order. It's no wonder that Holden and I got along so well. I devoured that book. I memorized specific paragraphs, illustrated scenes. I carried a copy with me everywhere I went like it was some kind of talisman. Years later, when I traveled overseas, entwined in a doomed romance with a melodramatic French musician, the book went along with me. And again, when I went across North America in a crummy van working for an LA punk band, the book was of course included on the journey, and thumbed through in dark bars, truck stops, and the most darling little cafe I've ever been to, folded into a pretty cobblestone street in Quebec. I dragged it around on buses, walking through the city. It became a sketchbook. Hundreds of poems were written in the book about the book. I would often pick it up, open to a random page, and begin reading like you might watch reruns of your favorite sitcom. I knew it like a favorite song. It was comforting, familiar, and communicated a perfect contradictory combination of cynicism and youthful optimism. It was punk rock. It was diary, reflection, crude. It led me to Charles Bukowski, Karl Marx, Bertrand Russell, Iggy Pop. It made me think that I might be a writer. Now, as I hold the book in my hands, turn the pages, smell the weathered paper, I understand that it wasn't just the content of the story that provided so much for me. The object itself became as much a mythology as its network of characters. The book itself became a place. The object was a world that I could slip into a small bag. When I picked up the book, without even opening it, the burgundy cover was recognized as the container of a very specific kind of autonomy that was inextricably tied to the time in which it was read, aligned with the context in which it was read, to the environment, experience, and psychic condition that would frame its interpretation. None of these elements could be extrapolated from one another. Neither could one element unto itself represent the complete essence of the meaning of the book. It was the relationship between object, time, and context that constituted the meaning of the book, that created the autonomous agency of the object. In other ways, the object became a surrogate of myself, an extension of my body. Projected into it were the many instances in which I felt ignored or victimized by structures outside of my control. Like Holden, my difficult experiences led me into feelings of suspicion, despair, and an underlying hope that redemption was possible, that you could make it. The fact that this narrative was composed through text on paper, bound together in a handheld object, was physical evidence that not only could you make it, but you could transform the stitches of heartbreak or devastation into art. That story could escape you, and that through that act you might escape the story too. Over the last few years, the book tags along with me less and less. And like any mythology, its utility is tied to need. The need for the story tied to time and place, and perhaps my need for this object has lessened. My relationship to it now is sentimental, in the same way you might look at an old photo of yourself. You remember the person in the image, but interpret that memory through your present consciousness. And in this way, the person pictured is a version of yourself that occupies another space, close in proximity, but distinguished by its location in your personal archive. And maybe, through the distance of memory, it becomes possible to compose a loving epitaph for heartbreak, turning the violence of institutions and trauma upside down with a smiling, liberated, fuck you.